Sir, I wish to see Jesus. Sir, I wish to see Jesus. The Greeks, the cultured ones coming from a distance, came and wished to see. The verb for see here is not just a physical sight, it's a sight that leads to insight. It's the sight that says, help me to see what you mean. Help me to see deeper. Maybe they were coming to see Jesus' miracles, and maybe they were coming to see his wise teaching, or his magnetism, the way he drew crowds who followed him. I suspect they did not come to see him be glorified in the way that he says now is the time. See, when he was doing miracles and when he was teaching and when he was drawing crowds, he kept saying each of those times, now is not the time for me to be glorified. Now is not the time. It isn't until now, this moment, that it is time. Jesus is saying it's not in the really good, wonderful things I'm doing that you all like so much, that look so good in the world's eyes. It's not the March Madness kind of glory or tragedy, depending on what team. Anyway, instead, this is a glory that is wholly upending all that we understand, all of life as we understand and live it and know it. Jesus says, unless the grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it bears no fruit. Those who hold their life will lose it, and those who give their life, lose their life, will receive it. I don't know about you, but I really doubt that's what the Greeks were looking for. And I suspect that you and I aren't particularly looking for this either. I think we're more interested in the kind of, Jesus, could you hook me up with a parking spot right now? I came to church. But Jesus is inviting us to live a wholly different way. A way that we are blind to see until we suddenly see it. Let's look at this morning's experience. Jesus is like a really good leader who understands that you not only need to be on the dance floor in the midst of things, but you need to know how to get up into the balcony, to see, to understand. If you will, the dance floor is the ordinary parts of our lives. People coming and going, the interactions that we have, the way we get mad when somebody does something irritating, and the way we easily let something flow when we feel safe and we can be vulnerable. It's the pressures of coming and going, trying not to bump into other people, trying to move with the music. It's a lot of work in our lives to just live well, is it not? But Jesus had the ability to get up and see from a much greater vantage point. He understood that his life had value not just as he bumped in and out of people's lives, healing them, feeding them, teaching them, helping them to experience, to see, to know what he was about in his interactions with them. He saw that the real value was so much bigger. That it wasn't about clinging to his individual life on earth, but that in letting that go, risking it all, that he might impact in a far greater way, bear fruit that if he clung, he would not have been able to bear. On the dance floor, we are driven by and interact with our egos in large part. It's a lot of one-upsmanship. It's a lot of, hey, you did that to me, well, I'll do this to you. There's a lot in our headlines that we experience. There's a lot in our daily interactions where our ego, in service of itself, thinks, hey, me too. Hey, I want room. Hey, pay attention to me. And the ego is doing a lot of work to try to gain that attention, that security, trying to manipulate things so that it's safe. It's our fight or flight It's our basic human instinct, and we all have it. We might sugarcoat it a little bit, but we're either fighting or flighting. Seeing from the larger perspective means putting our egos in service of something greater, allowing our egos to function, but to function in alignment, not with our own scrappiness, our own sense of, hey, I need my space, I need my room, give it to me. But instead with a generosity, with a joy that doesn't depend on whether things go my way or not, that doesn't depend on external circumstances, but depends from welling up from within, that abiding, that remaining that Jesus spoke about. It's bringing our ego in service to something greater. On the stage in this gospel, and just what follows, is a lot of ego jostling. The powers that be, self-righteousness, he needs to die. It's better for the whole group if he does. There's a lot of power over, right? If we just squash out him, it'll go away. And he uses his ego instead to freely choose to show us a different way. Jesus walks through all of that, and instead of one-upping, or instead of hiding, or playing the victim, oh, poor me, I didn't have any, well, look what's happening to me. He walks through it freely choosing. He says, my soul is hurting, I'm suffering, but I choose it. I choose to put my ego in service of something greater. I choose to do this so that you might know how to live your life as human beings in this way that's so expansive, in this way that's bigger than individually protecting our own, but is seeing the way we are deeply connected to all of creation, to all that we encounter. So what does that look like? What does it look like to choose freely, to move out of this ego-driven to an ego in service of something more? I'll show you. I'll show you what 150 kids who walked through the door of room 203 freshman year experienced. They were certain that they would flunk by the end of the year, partly because they didn't intend to do any work. They were pretty sure they would be incarcerated by the time they were 16, and they just kind of hoped they wouldn't have died by the time they were 18. They lived through the riots in Los Angeles in the 90s. Hundreds of people dying. They were parts of gangs just to try to make it safely. School was a jostling of power structures, the Asians, the Hispanics, the blacks, the whites, and everybody seething with fight or flight tendencies. A walk in the wrong place was like cause for war. And because they were so afraid, and because they were certain that this person who was going to teach them, whoever it was that was standing up in front of their class, didn't care about them, they didn't care either. And they were especially appalled and disgusted when their teacher walked in, a brand new teacher, in a polka dot dress and pearls. And they just were like, honey, you have no idea. You have no idea what our lives are like, what a war we walk through, even to be here. The only thing that united them was their despising of Aaron, their teacher. It was clear that there was no hope in that room. They knew she was just going to babysit them. They were just trying to make it another day. But Aaron wasn't there on accident. You see, Aaron had been inspired by the stories of her father from the civil rights era. And Aaron had been moved deeply when she saw a young man standing, on a picture of a young man standing in front of a tank in Tiananmen Square, willing to give up his life for something so much greater. And she chose to be there, to be with these kids who had no hope, whose lives were wrecked. And she stood in that class for purpose. It was hard to break through. They'd never read any book. They didn't own any. They were totally unmotivated. But she knew that they had a story, as we all do. And one way that she discovered to help open that was by drawing a line down the center of the room. And she asked questions. And if you answered yes to the question, you stood to the center line. And if you didn't, you stepped back. So she started with things like, who knows where your next meal will come from? Half the class stood out, half together. Who has 2 family members in your household? Who has 2 parents in your home? Most stepped away. Who have been incarcerated? She knew some had because they were wearing the bands on their leg. About 3/4 stepped to the middle. She kept asking questions so that she could get to know them. And in fact, they got to know each other. When she asked, who of you have lost someone to death? Nearly everyone stepped to the line. Rival gang member standing across the line from rival gang member. Something broke open in that classroom that day. They began to see that what they thought separated them was nothing compared to what bound them. She had a toast for change after that exercise. With bubbling cider, she encouraged people to step forward and make a toast for change. Some small thing that they could do in their lives to be different, to step into something different. And the first person who was brave enough to step forward was a girl, and she said, I dream of not being pregnant before I'm 15. I dream of not being incarcerated like my father. I dream of not being dead by 18 like my cousin. Her courage empowered the courage of others until one by one they dared to dream dreams. They dared to let go of a life of ego, driven to protect only itself, or perhaps gangs members, in service of something more, of something bigger. The classes went on to read Diary of Anne Frank, and they wrote letters. They wrote in journals to them, share what their stories were, and they shared them with Aaron, their teacher. Eventually, they mailed those letters to the person who hid Anne Frank all those years. And they raised money, and she came to spend time with them. And she told them that they were the heroes. Eventually, they dreamed a dream of going to Washington, D.C. on a bus like the Freedom Riders had. And they called themselves the Freedom Writers, writing themselves and each other a new story. They raised the money to do that, 150 of them who never went further than the few small area that they had lived. And they went all the way to Washington, D.C. And for one event, they pinned on their shirt a symbol with someone's name that had died, so that they would know that person was being remembered. And as they went from their hotel to the memorial they were going to see one night, they linked hands, 150 of them, of every race, tribe, bonding themselves to each other. And as they crossed each of those streets, the Manhattan drivers couldn't figure it out. But the students knew. All 150 graduated 4 years later, and they went to college. You can read their stories. You can read from the Freedom Riders' diaries, which hit bestseller in 1999. You can watch the movie Freedom Riders. In 2006 it came out. It's a powerful story. They saw Jesus, and their lives reflected Jesus. And if they can do it, so can we, you and me. But it isn't by a sheer force of will. It's not by thinking our way through. How many times have we said, I'm going to be nice to this person, only to find ourselves seeping out at the edges and not being so nice when things get tense? Instead, it's understanding that we move from this ego-driven understanding into the eyes of our heart. All the scriptures this morning talk about this heart within, that God has put this covenant, that we may know this way. The story of Jesus' passion is not meant, Cynthia Berchot says, to evoke empathy or even guilt or shame, as it has so often been purported to do. It's to empower. It's to empower us to do the primary work that we are to do as human beings, which is to overcome our basic animal instincts with this larger part of a whole, getting up on the balcony of our own lives and living, breathing Jesus in all that we are and do. The cover of your bulletin this morning comes from the chapel of the Great Thanksgiving in Dallas. It was designed and put together as part of the whole monument towards giving thanks that 4 businessmen in Dallas from different faith traditions sought to make possible. They wanted, you see, to understand that life was more than the financial success. It was about living in this place of the heart. And so it's a welcoming place for people to come of all faiths. And this chapel is actually built in a cylinder with the roof line going ever higher to that peak. And it's a picture taken with somebody lying down and seeing it from above. And the artist of the stained glass window, this glory window, said it was coming from Psalm 19, where it talks about the light of God shining through all of our lives. And they intended it to represent that the light shines through the good and the bad, the challenges and the joys. And that when we step back and see our life as a whole, it's like this spiral, this beautiful spiral that wouldn't be the same if any of those colors were missing. And finally bursting forth in the glory of gold. May we have courage to see Jesus in ourselves, in the others that we encounter, in the people who are wildly different from us, in all of creation. May we see Jesus, know him, and as we do, truly science tells us that our hearts, our heart rate, our neurons start to mirror others, and we come in alignment. And it happens one-on-one, but it happens with whole groups, like the students in Aaron's classroom. May we open ourselves to this, that we may bear that light, embody that light in the world. Sir, we wish to see and know Jesus. May we glorify and be glorified as well.